Hello and welcome. I'm Asuma Katauka and you are watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov presented a new idea on Ukraine during their meeting in Malaysia. Rubio stressed the concept would be discussed with President Donald Trump but warned it may not automatically lead to peace. Meanwhile, Russia claims to have shot down 3 Ukrainian drones headed for Moscow, according to Mayor Sergei Sobyanin, while the Russian Defense Ministry reported 14 drones downed over Bryansk and 8 over Belgorod region. Russia's aviation authority also halted flights at Kaluga Airport, 200 kilometers southwest of Moscow, according to media reports. Gaza's civil defense says at least 52 people, including 8 children, died in Israeli strikes across the territory today. Officials told AFP that 17 were killed in their el-Balah alone, with casualties including women and children, as AFP awaits Israeli military comments. The U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says Washington remains committed to its Asia-Pacific partnerships despite threats of new tariffs. Speaking in Kuala Lumpur, Rubio said the region is still a focal point and the U.S. plans to build stronger ties. The halt to U.S. foreign aid is a ticking time bomb, says UN, while saying the halt threatens to reverse decades of progress in the global fight against AIDS. UN has also said it will undermine treatment and prevention programs worldwide, according to the UN reports. Blackstone raised its bid for UK's warehouse rate to $666 million, offering 115 pence per share, and outbidding Tritax Big Box's agreed deal, according to media reports. The revised offer, including cash and dividends, lifted warehouse rate shares by 2.8% amid a wave of US firms buying up British assets. Ukraine's President Zelensky called on allies to impose new sanctions quickly after Moscow's massive overnight attack with 400 drones and 18 missiles. He warned pressure must be strong enough to Russia to truly feel the consequences of its ongoing terror. Britain and France are set to finalize a migrant return deal as per Keir Starmer hosts President Macron on the last day of his state visit. The talks also cover support for Ukraine and a defense reboot, including joint missile development and peacekeeping plans. In a high-stakes diplomatic exchange, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio met with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov on the sidelines of the ASEAN summit in Malaysia. Rubio revealed that Lavrov floated a new idea on Ukraine, though not a breakthrough. It could open the door to possible negotiations. The 50-minute meeting comes amid a deadly spike in Russian attacks on Kyiv, with missiles and drones raining down on the capital just hours before. Rubio says he relayed President Trump's frustration over Moscow's lack of flexibility and stressed the urgent need for a roadmap to end the war. Let's listen in to what the U.S. Secretary of State had to say on these talks.
We will engage any time that we have an opportunity to do so, like we did today. I echoed what the President has said, both a disappointment and frustration at the lack of progress in peace talks or in a path forward. So we'll continue to engage. We shared some ideas and comments, which I'll take back to Washington as early as this evening in terms of calls and reflected, and perhaps there's something to build on there. So, but it was a frank conversation. It was an important one. We had it, and we talked about some other items as well and related to the war in Ukraine, but that was well, the President has said that that's an option that's available to him, both under existing authorities, but primarily if the Senate and the House can pass legislation that gives them the opportunity to do that. So we've been engaging with Congress on what that bill would look like. Obviously, the President needs flexibility on how those sanctions would be applied and when. because it gives them, maximum leverage in any conversation and negotiation. So he has talked about that as being a real option, and now obviously we've been engaging with the Senate in particular over the last week on what that bill will look like, and the leaders of both chambers have said that they're prepared to begin to move forward on that. We've expressed this to the Russians weeks ago. We told them that the moment would come where something like this could happen, and we'll continue to express it because that's the reality.
Meanwhile, Rubio also signaled optimism on Gaza's ceasefire, saying U.S. Envoy Steve Witkoff is hopeful that proximity talks could be held soon. With rising global tensions, Washington appears to be pushing harder on multiple diplomatic fronts. Let's listen in.
I spoke to Steve Witkoff last night, and he's optimistic that proximity talks will begin fairly soon, expedited and facilitated by the Qataris and the Egyptians. And so, but we've seen talks fall apart in the past at that stage of proximity talks. So I think we're closer, and I think perhaps we're closer than we've been in quite a while, and we're hopeful. But we also recognize there's still some challenges in the way, and one of the fundamental challenges is Hamas's unwillingness to disarm, which would end this conflict immediately.
Now we're joined by Keith Vaz. He's a former UK minister, joining us live from London. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to NewsX World. How significant is this new idea from Lavrov? Could it really lead to meaningful negotiations on Ukraine, according to you?
Well, any meeting between the foreign minister of Russia and the Secretary of State of the United States is very welcome. From my dealings with Lavrov when I was the Minister for Europe, he dealt directly, obviously, with the Foreign Minister of the UK, but I had the privilege of attending those meetings. Lavrov is a very wily figure. He's been there for a couple of decades, so he wouldn't be saying things unless they were meaningful. As you know, from day one, the Trump administration has talked about a ceasefire in the Ukraine. This is one of the big wins that Donald Trump has always wanted. And so far, it's eluded him. And in the last week, he's been quite critical of President Putin. And he didn't really want to deal with him, he said. So this is very positive. And so long as it leads to a meaningful discussion and a ceasefire, then it is something that one should welcome. But you should put that against the meeting that Emmanuel Macron had yesterday with Keir Starmer in London, and a demand from the President of France and the other European leaders that there should be a ceasefire. The call from Chancellor Merkel recently that there should be reparations being paid, supported by Mr. Kellogg from the United States, putting the costs at about 500 billion. So we're in the right language, but we're nowhere near getting to the ceasefire that both Russia and the Ukraine desperately need.
And Keith, why do you think Russia chose to float this idea now? What's the timing? What does this suggest?
Well, they seem to be doing quite well as far as the war is concerned. We understand that they have been capturing more territory. Obviously, with the Trump administration, the support for Ukraine was not as strong as it was under President Biden. So there have been differences between the two administrations. But I think that the Russians are, and Lavrov in particular, is a very, very, very clever man. He has been around, as I said, for a very long time, and he would not be saying this unless there is a pathway in his mind to get things moving in a particular direction. I'm afraid that Marco Rubio, though he's experienced as a senator from Florida in the US Senate, comes nowhere near the experience of someone like Lavrov. And he should be very cautious and careful in dealing with such a wily operator as Mr. Lavrov.
And now I would press on about Rubio's comments or message about President Trump's frustrations. Does that suggest any shift in US's policy towards Ukraine?
Well, Donald Trump is always frustrated unless something happens tomorrow or today. But the world of diplomacy does not behave like that. It takes a long time to build up alliances, and he would do well to work with his NATO allies, in particular Germany and France and the United Kingdom. Those three countries have been working hard to make sure that there are proper discussions and proper support being given to the peace process. I think the problem with the President of the United States is he wants to do it all himself. And that's not how diplomacy works in the world. Of course, America is the most powerful country on earth with the biggest defense budget on the planet. But still, you do need to work with people if you're going to get change. And therefore, it is important that we act and behave in a way that understands you can't solve everything immediately in diplomacy. As someone who's worked in the Foreign Office, who's had to deal with many, many different European countries over the period of time that I was a minister, it takes a lot of time to build up those relationships. They don't exist at the moment between Russia and the United States because they've been in cold storage for the 4 years that Biden has been president. So this will take time, but this is an important step forward. And I think everyone hopes that there will be peace. On the subject of the call for reparations and rebuilding, the best way to bring down the cost of rebuilding Ukraine is for the Russians to stop bombing Ukraine and for people to get to that table, sit round it, America, Russia, and the Ukraine, together with Britain, France, and Germany, and get those peace talks going. That's the best way to end this conflict, to get round the table and start talking peace.
And does this meeting show any cracks in Moscow's strategy, or is it more about buying time on the battlefield, according to you?
Well, I don't know. I mean, they are very clever operators, the Russians. They have been here before many times. They wouldn't have invaded if they didn't think they had an end game. Of course, it's taken much longer. No one expected Ukraine to have survived so long as an independent country. So they're probably a bit frustrated. I think President Putin expected to be in Kiev within days of invading. It did not happen. And therefore that shows that the best way forward is for countries to work together. I'm not sure that it shows any weakness on the part of the Russians or any strength on the part of the Americans. What it does show is they're talking to get the US Secretary of State and to get the Foreign Minister of Russia in the same room talking about the same topic. That's a big win for all, I think. We just need to make sure they see it through to the end.
Yes, indeed. And thank you very much for sharing that. You will stay with us as we stay on the region. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has called on US President Donald Trump to stand shoulder to shoulder with Europe in supporting Ukraine, speaking at a global conference in Rome aimed at rebuilding the war-battered country. Merz added that he personally asked Trump to approve the sale of additional US Patriot missile systems to Kyiv, though a final decision is still pending. The German leader also called out Slovakia for blocking the new EU sanctions on Russia, urging Prime Minister Robert Fico to, quote, give up the resistance. Let's listen into what German Chancellor Friedrich Merz had to say.
Standing with Ukraine. In finalizing, I have two messages. The one goes to Moscow and to President Putin. The message is quite simple. We will not give up. And dear friends, my second message goes to Washington, D.C. and to President Donald Trump. Stay with us and stay with the Europeans. We are on the same page and we are looking for a stable political order in this world. We are preparing package number 18 within the European Union of sanctions against Russia. There is only one member state missing to agree on that. I urgently ask Slovakia and its Prime Minister to give up the resistance and to make the way free for package number 18 within the European Union.
Now we go back to our discussion with Keith Vaz. He's a former UK minister joining us live from London. Thank you for staying with us. Now that Polish Prime Minister has, Polish Prime Minister, German Friedrich Merz has said that kind of attacking or criticizing Slovakia up front. Do you think this shows maybe dividend or division between the EU states towards Ukraine?
Well, the EU is a very difficult horse to run. The 27 countries that make up the EU all have their own identities. Slovakia and Hungary have made it clear from the very beginning that they take a different view of the whole idea of sanctions and dealing with the Russian situation in Ukraine. So I'm not surprised that this is happening, but it's good that Chancellor Merkel is now taking a proper place in the pantheon of leaders in Europe. He is the Chancellor of the most powerful country in Europe. It's got the biggest economy, and therefore when the German Chancellor speaks, everyone should listen. Of course, he's criticizing a colleague in the EU. That's a matter for him. But what needs to happen is Europe needs to speak with one voice. If you look at the figures, there's been approximately $152 billion worth of damage to Ukraine. And the estimate is that it's going to cost a further $486 billion to reconstruct. So this is a lot of money. So when the Chancellor talks about providing more missiles to Ukraine, that's just going to add to the damage in this country. What everyone should be trying to do is bring the sides together. There needs to be a ceasefire and peace between these two countries. The role of the EU is to bring these countries together, as actually Donald Trump seems to want to do, rather than to continue with a battle between Russia and Ukraine. In the end, it's the EU taxpayer who's going to pick up the bill, I fear. Now, we do know that a lot of Russian assets have been seized and are in European banks. To give an example, Chelsea Football Club, which was owned by a Russian, all the assets were seized, and the owner, Roman Abramovich, was made to sell the football club. So the assets are still there. So there are many ways in which you can seize these assets, but they need to be done lawfully. They need to be done legally. The rule of law has to be followed, especially in a country like the United Kingdom. So speeches are one thing, action is different, and we need to make sure we get that peace process started. What's happening between Rubio and Lavrov should be mirrored by what Europe is doing. That is the best way forward.
Thank you very much for sharing that insight. Keith, you will stay with us as we stay in the region. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, speaking at the same conference, said Poland would play a special role in Ukraine's reconstruction, focused on transport, trade, and investment. Let's listen in to what he had to say.
Poland will play a special role in the recovery process. My government has developed a coherent model of support. First, investment in our infrastructure, roads, railways, and logistics, which mainly serves to help Ukraine. Second, connectivity. The Polish corridors through which 90% of military and humanitarian aid is currently flowing to Ukraine. The same routes will carry goods for the reconstruction tomorrow. Third, trade. Today, 30% of EU exports to Ukraine is coming from Poland.
Now we have heard Polish Prime Minister speak, and he's calling for more cooperation to his fellows and his allies for Ukraine. Meanwhile, U.S. Envoy Keith Kellogg stressed the need for a comprehensive and lasting peace, not just a ceasefire. Trump, who had earlier halted some aid, has now promised to increase weapons supplies to Kyiv and criticized Putin's narrative as bullshit. Let's listen into what Kellogg had to say.
The destruction caused by the war is also why the United States is partnering with Ukraine to see a full restoration of this nation following a peace settlement. The United States recognizes that rebuilding Ukraine will be an enormous yet critical task that will have implications on the broader European region. We also recognize that the reconstruction of Ukraine goes well beyond just rebuilding the physical infrastructure of Ukraine, as it entails addressing the social and economic impacts of the war as well. This includes safely bringing back all Ukrainian refugees, securing the return of all illegally kidnapped Ukrainian children, ensuring that veterans of Ukraine's armed forces are given the proper care for their rehabilitation back into Ukrainian society, and undergoing a comprehensive demining operation to ensure safety for all Ukrainians in the future. On the economic side, future investments into Ukraine depend on a stable security situation. Investors need confidence, and investors need assurance that any peace deal reached will provide long-term security. That is why our efforts to secure peace are not set on just getting to a temporary ceasefire, but is instead focused on reaching a comprehensive and permanent peace settlement.
Ukrainian First Lady Olena Zelenska warned that over 5,000 drones and thousands of bombs struck Ukrainian cities in June alone. Let's listen in to what she had to say.
Ukraine, we have learned this through pain, and we would not wish such suffering on anyone. And so, amid fierce defense, we have made saving lives our top priority, in every sense, physical, social, and mental. Our principle is restore the individual, and they will restore everything else, only in that order. Our economy continues to function thanks to millions of people who go to work after spending their nights in basements. But in those moments, the main emotions they carry are fatigue, tension, and despair. Already in the first months of the Russian invasion, Ukraine responded to this challenge with the All-Ukrainian Mental Health Program, How Are You?, which I patronize. It is a full support system in which all ministers, regions, and communities are involved and work in coordination.
EU Chief Ursula von der Leyen announced a massive European flagship fund to back reconstruction, saying Europe is taking a stake in Ukraine's future. Let's listen in to what she had to say.
I am particularly pleased to announce today the European Flagship Fund for the Reconstruction of Ukraine, the largest equity fund globally to support reconstruction.
Meanwhile, host nation Italy, under Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, reaffirmed its commitment to Kyiv during a meeting with President Volodymyr Zelensky on the sidelines. Now we move on to our next news. In a clear message to Israel, the German and Austrian foreign ministers jointly called for a greater humanitarian access to Gaza during a press briefing in Vienna. While affirming their country's support for Israel's security, both ministers stressed that international law and human rights cannot be sidelined. Austrian Foreign Minister Beat Reisinger warned against any moves to permanently occupy Gaza or displace its population, insisting Gaza must remain Palestinian. Her German counterpart, Johann Weidpool, echoed concerns, saying the suffering of civilians, especially starving children, demands urgent action. Let's listen in to the Austrian and German foreign ministers.
Ja, ich teile diese Sorge über diese israelischen Pläne oder Wortmeldungen bezüglich einer dauerhaften Besatzung und Vertreibung der palästinensischen Bevölkerung aus Teilen Gazas. Gaza muss aus österreichischer Sicht palästinensisch bleiben. Und es ist auch Gegenstand unserer Gespräche, dass wir immer wieder darauf hinweisen, dass Israel im legitimen Kampf gegen den Terrorismus an das Völkerrecht gebunden ist. Unser Ziel ist es, vollumfänglich zu Verhandlungen zurückzukehren.
Wir setzen darauf, dass die Waffenstillstandsbemühungen erfolgreich sind. Ich habe darüber auch gestern noch einmal mit meinem US-Kollegen Marco Rubio telefoniert. Wir sehen die Aussicht, ich sehe die Aussicht, dass wir zu einem guten Ergebnis kommen. Ich habe auch in den vergangenen Tagen noch einmal dem katarischen Außenminister mitgeteilt, dass die Welt sehr darauf achtet, dass jetzt auch auf Hamas der notwendige Druck entfaltet wird.
The two ministers expressed hope that recent EU-Israel talks could lead to improved aid delivery and possibly pave the way for ceasefire. Responding to these calls, Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar said his country has taken concrete steps following talks with the EU, including more aid trucks, crossings, and routes into Gaza. He also confirmed that Israel is serious about reaching a hostage deal and ceasefire, with negotiations ongoing in Doha. Let's listen into what the Israeli Foreign Minister had to say.
Israel is serious in its will to achieve a hostage deal and the ceasefire in Gaza, and I believe it is achievable. We sent a delegation to Doha, and we are negotiating there already for the 5th day. And according to the framework, if a temporary ceasefire will be achieved, we will negotiate on a permanent ceasefire.
Now we're joined for this discussion with Nasser Mashni. He's a president at Australia Palestine Advocacy Network, joining us live from London. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to NewsX World. How much pressure does this joint statement put on Israel to allow more humanitarian access into Gaza, and does this have any impact according to you?
Well, thank you for having me, and absolutely no impact. Further, merely words from complicit governments as the Palestinians in Gaza are suffering what can only be described now as a Holocaust. We have the Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz, talking about concentrating Palestinians into one area. We know what that means. We've seen it before in 1939 in Germany. It's a concentration camp. Israel's moving beyond the first stage of this genocide, moving to a complete and utter genocide.
Even though you've shown pessimism, is there any realistic path for Europe to help broker solutions that protect civilians and address those humanitarian needs on the ground in Gaza?
It's been 642 days where Europe could have done something, should have done something, but did nothing. They abrogated their responsibility to the Palestinians, to humanity, to international law. Germany and the EU continues to supply weaponry. They remain complicit in the Holocaust being perpetuated on the Palestinian people.
And now, looking at this, how do Germany and Austria balance supporting Israel's security with calling out actions that could violate international law?
Well, there is no balance between Israel's security as an occupying power and the people that it occupies, who have an internationally enshrined right to self-defense and to fight against an illegal occupation. We are beyond the words of what the European Union might be able to do, or Germany or any of those other countries might do. What needs to happen is a total and utter arms embargo and immediate sanctions on Israel until it stops this genocide.
Do you think that other countries will follow this lead? Could this message from two major EU countries push other European nations to adopt a stronger stance on Gaza?
Well, these words are nothing. I don't know why you entertain any value to them. They have been saying these words for 641 days, and Israel has ignored them. They ignored Biden's red line on Rafah. They've ignored the UN call for a ceasefire. They've ignored UN special rapporteurs. Israel is a rogue genocidal apartheid state that cannot be allowed to exist in the way it does. It exists this way purely because of the way the legitimacy that the West confers upon it. It's time for this illegitimate state to cease existing. We need sanctions on it, as we did in apartheid South Africa. We need sanctions, we need divestment, and we need to hold it to account. Israel and its leaders need to go to The Hague to face the full impacts of international law, and the leaders of these parties need to be held accountable in jail for the rest of their lives, and reparations have to be made to the Palestinians that have suffered.
And how might Israel respond to its close European allies or partners warning against permanent occupation or the displacement of Gazans to any other location?
I've got to tell you, in 640 days, this is the funniest question I've had. Have you paid any attention to how Israel has reacted to everything that Europe has said? Israel doesn't care one iota what anyone says other than America, until the European countries stand up, show their independence, and actually stand up for humanity, a common humanity for all. Israel will continue to ignore and continue to kill. That's why the streets are filled with protesters demanding real action for the Palestinian people, because they've been let down by their governments who have abrogated, and their loss of humanity is just beggars belief that we're in a situation where 640 days people have been starved, killed, there's not a school left. Children, Palestinian children, haven't been to school for 21 months. Israel, in all its barbarity, destroyed the only IVF clinic in Gaza, destroying 4,000 embryos, denying Palestinian men and women the chance of having families. Do you think they care what a German chancellor says or a foreign minister? They don't care, which is why they need to be held accountable, and there needs to be sanctions on this rogue genocidal apartheid state.
Nasser, what's your message to the international community about protecting Gaza's Palestinian identity and population?
I don't think I could have been much clearer. The world created this problem when they made Palestinians pay for the European disease of anti-Semitism. The Palestinians had no involvement in the Holocaust. The Palestinians had no involvement in Russian pogroms, Spanish Inquisition, or any of the other horrors that befell the Jewish people. Yet we were made to pay the price. We were made to pay the price, and we live in exile, we live in occupation, and currently being genocided. What needs to happen is the world needs to step up and make sure this stops. They need to be sending thousands of ships in flotillas to break the blockade, and military intervention. Not just Iran, all countries should be threatening military intervention on Israel until it stops this genocide.
Nasser, thank you for sharing that. You will stay with us as we stay on this topic. A senior official from the Arab League has revealed that ongoing discussions between China and Egypt are expected to reveal significant areas of agreement as both nations work to deepen their strategic partnership. These talks are being held within the framework of the China-Arab States Cooperation Forum, or CAS-CF, which serves as the key platform for coordinating cooperation between China and the Arab world. Central to the agenda are pressing regional issues, including the escalating conflict in Gaza. Both sides aim to address the implications of this conflict in regional security and stability, highlighting the importance of diplomatic collaboration in the Middle East during these turbulent times. Beyond political concerns, the talks will also focus heavily on expanding economic partnerships, trade, technological exchange, as well as renewable energy initiatives. These are seen as critical sectors where China and Arab nations, especially Egypt, can cooperate to promote sustainable development and support ongoing normalization efforts in the region. Further announcements are expected once the talks conclude, as both sides look to outline concrete steps for cooperation moving forward. Now we go back to our guest discussion with Nasser Marshni. He's a president at Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network. Thank you, Nasser, for staying with us. Now, you have mentioned in our previous discussion that maybe there's not much that European countries are doing or could do. Do you think Arab countries, on the other hand, can do something now or are doing enough?
Well, indeed, Arab countries can and should do more, but they haven't. They are sycophantic to the American Western hegemony and Western empire. We've seen that absolutely with those that have signed the Abraham Accords. We've seen that with the land corridor that has been enabled by the Emirates, whilst the Houthis and the Yemenis have made sure that the Israeli shipping has been denied through the Red Sea. The Arab regimes are merely participating and as complicit as the European Union in the genocide that's happening.
And well, still looking into this topic, how significant is this deepening strategic partnership between China and Egypt for the wider Arab world?
Well, anything that disconnects American imperialism, American hegemony in the Middle East can only be a good sign. I'm hopeful that that breakdown or a breaking of that American stronghold over the Gulf and the Arab countries might augur better conditions for all, for not just for Palestine and the Middle East, but for the rest of the world. We need a world tomorrow where people are treated equally, that we're judged by the content of our character, not by our religion, not by the color of our skin. The reality is we have seen so many dead, innocent men, women, and children. And it beggars belief that the world is watching this live streamed 4K digital genocide, and it's allowed to happen on all our watches. It's shameful.
Yes, and now going back to our discussion topic, what role can China realistically play in addressing regional security issues like the conflict in Gaza?
Well, look, it depends on how much it wants to intervene. Does it want to be a regional superpower? Does it want to do that? From all my understanding of China's ambitions, it wishes to be an economic power, not a regional military power. So its engagement would depend on what it wants to do. I'm not Chinese. I don't know what the Chinese plans are for the Middle East. What I do know is that the garrison state that is Israel, the barbaric apartheid state that is Israel, exists in the way it does because of white supremacy, because of Western imperialism and Western hegemony. And it has to end. It has to end. You cannot do what Israel has done to the Palestinian people for a century now and get away with it.
Yes, and Nasser, although we don't know, it's unclear about what China's intentions are with the Arab ties. Could stronger China-Arab ties shift this balance of influence in the Middle East away from the West?
Look, it possibly could. I don't know how much investment China wants to do, how much engagement it wants to do. I'm no Chinese expert. What I do know is who is to blame. And who is to blame is American imperialism, American Western hegemony, and Zionism as an ideology, a despicable, racist, hate-filled ideology.
And how might Egypt benefit economically from these new trade paths with, with China?
Again, I'm not an Egyptian economic expert, but I imagine any export markets that Egypt might be able to open up will help their economy, might be able to unpin their dependence on US aid, which would necessarily open up the opportunity for a more independent foreign policy. But whilst Egypt is ruled by a dictator, I don't imagine that things will change very quickly. All we need is democratic reforms throughout the Arab world.
Thank you very much, Nasser Mashni, for joining us today and sharing your insight as president of Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network. Now we move on to our next news. A major diplomatic rift is deepening after the United States imposed sanctions on United Nations human rights expert Francesca Albanese. The UN Special Rapporteur, who has repeatedly condemned Israel's actions in Gaza, dismissed the U.S. move as mafia-style intimidation techniques. Albanese, who monitors human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories, said she remains focused on holding nations accountable under international law. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced the sanctions, accusing her of waging political and economic warfare against the U.S. and Israel. The move has drawn sharp criticism from global rights groups and UN officials. Albanese also called out European governments for allowing Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to travel through their airspace despite an ICC arrest warrant. UN Rights Chief Volker Turk has demanded the sanctions be reversed, warning that such attacks on UN experts undermine international institutions. Now let's listen into what the UN experts had to say on the sanctions.
I mean, this is a record. I am the first UN person to be imposed a sanction for what? For having exposed the genocide? For having denounced the system? I mean, they've never challenged me on the facts. I've given these companies the opportunity to correct me. Instead, they've gone whining to the US administration to treat me as they are. It's okay. This speaks to who they are. Yes, of course it will be challenging, but what I want to say, if a human being, I'm just a human being, I'm not even paid to do what I'm doing, okay? So I'm putting really everything I have in the line. If I can do that, all of you, all your people, all your politicians, and my people can do at least that. Together we can stand this pressure, and together we can really get out of this genocide as with a hope for a better world, because otherwise it will be much worse.
Now we're joined for this discussion with John Rossomando. He's a president of Viking Research Associates and a geopolitical analyst, joining us live from Washington, D.C. Thank you, John, for joining us today. Good to see you. Thank you. How unprecedented is it for the U.S. to impose such sanctions on a UN human rights expert? And what message does this send internationally?
Well, let's put it this way. The United Nations has been a biased partner in all of this. It has done absolutely nothing to stop Hamas from firing rockets, did nothing to prevent it from smuggling weapons, diverting international humanitarian aid, to build military tunnels under schools, under hospitals, under mosques, which according to the 1949 Geneva Convention deprives those structures of protection under international law. And the United Nations, the UNWRA, has had Hamas members on its staff. And we've had evidence that the UN had some of its employees involved in the massacre of Israelis. So, calling them a concern about human rights is absolutely ridiculous.
And John, do you think this will set a precedent for targeting other international officials who criticize such major powers?
Well, it's not a matter of criticizing major powers. This isn't about free speech. This is about a United Nations entity not being a neutral partner in this. It's been a biased organization that has protected the terrorists. Let's put it this way: there is no occupation in Gaza. Israel withdrew in 2005. I mean, the mistake that the West made was allowing elections that brought Hamas to power, and Hamas decided to turn Gaza into a terrorist emirate that's no different than ISIS in Raqqa or ISIS in Mosul. And its ultimate goal, according to Hamas leaders, destruction of Israel to build their caliphate.
Thank you, John, for sharing that insight. You will stay with us as we stay on this topic. The United Nations has warned that cuts to U.S. foreign aid risk reversing decades of progress in the fight against AIDS. In 2024, over 31 million people were in antiretroviral treatment, and AIDS-related deaths had fallen by more than half since 2010. But the sudden halt in U.S. funding has forced many prevention and treatment programs to close, raising fears of a sharp rise in infections and deaths. Let's listen in to what UNAIDS Executive Director Winnie Byanyima has said in a recent interview.
It is cruel. It is cruel. It is quite unprecedented because, yes, we see that countries have different challenges, even the rich ones. Priorities can shift. But you do not take away life-saving support from people just like that. You make a plan. You have a smooth transition. You give governments an opportunity to raise the resources they need to fill in the space. We are saying to the donors, stay in the global solidarity that has led us to achieve this progress and work towards gradual, planned, sustainable transitions with the developing countries. So there's progress, but there are still gaps. And now the risk is real that with this sudden withdrawal of funding by the biggest donor and the gradual cuts by the others, we're seeing that new infections could rise if plans are not in place to mitigate this. New infections could rise up by an additional 6 million. We're talking of 1.3 now, but they could increase by 6 million by 2029.
If the cuts continue, experts warn there could be over 6 million new infections and 4 million more deaths in the next 4 years, levels unseen since the early 2000s. Women-led HIV groups and research efforts, especially in places like Nigeria and South Africa, have been hit hard. UNAIDS urges countries to boost domestic funding and calls for international reforms to help sustain the fight. Despite the setbacks, UNAID remains hopeful about the resilience and ongoing value of global HIV efforts. Now we go back to our guest discussion with John Rossomando. He's a president at Viking Research Associates and geopolitical analyst. Thank you, John, for staying with us. What geopolitical factors might be driving this sudden halt in funding? Is it purely budgetary or more strategic, according to you?
Well, let's put it this way. This is just a shot across the bow to the United Nations that it has to do a better job of being an impartial mediator here. It's completely on the side of the terrorists. It has done absolutely nothing to ensure that Gaza remains peaceful. That you have 50,000, by some estimates, Hamas terrorists, who blend in with the population, who use hospitals as bases of, operations. You had Mohammed al-Sinwar, who had a bunker under one of the hospitals in Gaza. You have, the Hamas constantly breaks international law when it comes to its endangerment of the population. Gaza is basically for Hamas one big human shield to protect against it firing rockets, sending provocations such as the murder of over 1,000 Israelis who were at a peace concert. I mean, we need to have a United Nations that is impartial, that is even-handed, and that does not cater to one side or the other.
And John, what role might other major donors like the EU or China play in filling this funding gap if they are willing to?
Well, they'll probably fill the gap. But this is a statement by the United States that the United Nations cannot be a supporter of terrorists. It cannot include terrorists and to the terrorist-controlled Gaza Ministry of Health has been shown to use faulty numbers and to create an inflated death toll. mean, most of the fighters, by reliable statistics, most people who have been killed have been Hamas fighters or those associated with them. Now, what we need is to have the Arab League step up and put together a governing plan for Gaza so that Israel can have its security, the Palestinians can have their freedom, and we can live in peace.
Thank you, John Rossomando, for joining us today and sharing your insight as president of Viking Research Associates and also as a geopolitical analyst as well. Now we move on to our next news. Elon Musk is under fire after his AI chatbot Grok generated responses that praised Adolf Hitler and made inflammatory remarks on sensitive topics. In a post on X, Musk admitted Grok had been too compliant and eager to please, leading to offensive and manipulated outputs. He says the issue is being fixed. The controversy erupted after screenshots showed Grok naming Hitler as the best figure to respond to so-called anti-white hate. The Anti-Defamation League condemned the posts as dangerous and anti-Semitic, warning they fuel rising extremism online. In response, Turkey has blocked access to Grok and launched a criminal investigation after the bot allegedly insulted President Erdogan. Poland has also reported Musk's company XAI to the European Commission for offensive comments made about Prime Minister Donald Tusk. Grok has previously faced criticism for referencing conspiracy theories, including claims of white genocide. Musk insists the chatbot has since improved, but global concerns over AI bias and hate speech continue to mount. Let's take a look at some stories from the world of sports. England's goalkeeper Hannah Hampton is earning praise not just for her saves but for her exceptional passing. In a key 4-0 victory over the Netherlands, Hampton delivered a stunning long ball that set up the team's opening goal, showcasing her vision and control under pressure. The win silenced critics after England's shaky start to the tournament and marked a strong comeback for the reigning Women's Euro champions, with Mary Earps retiring just weeks before the tournament. Hampton's performance signals a confident new era in goal for the Lionesses. A major shake-up at Red Bull Racing. Longtime team principal Christian Horner has been sacked after nearly 2 decades at the helm. Horner, who led Red Bull to multiple world titles since 2005, has been replaced by Racing Bull's Laurent Mekies. Red Bull confirmed Mekies will now oversee all Formula One operations at their Milton Keynes base, while Alain Permain takes charge of Racing Bulls. Horner, whose contract was set to run until 2030, called his leadership the biggest privilege of his life in a farewell address to the team. American tennis star Ben Shelton is out of Wimbledon after a straight sets defeat to world number 1 Jannik Sinner in the quarterfinals. Despite firing powerful serves and pushing the top seed early on, Shelton fell 7-6, 6-4, 6-4. The 22-year-old admitted that rushing his serve cost him key points and praised Sinner's calm, calculated play, saying it felt like playing on fast forward. Sinner now advances to the semifinals as he continues his bid for a maiden Wimbledon title. Former Utah Jazz coach and executive Frank Layden has passed away at the age of 93. Layden led the Jazz from 1981 to 1989 and was also the team's general manager and president until 1999. He won both NBA Coach and Executive of the Year honors in 1984. Layden was instrumental in drafting legends John Stockton and Karl Malone, laying the groundwork for Utah's 20-year playoff streak and back-to-back finals appearances in the late 1990s. The European Court's Grand Chamber has upheld a 2023 decision that Caster Semenya's appeal against testosterone regulations wasn't properly heard by Swiss courts. The ruling does not overturn World Athletics policy requiring DSD female athletes to medically lower testosterone levels to compete, while Semenya, now 34 and no longer racing, says she is not seeking reinstatement. She vows to continue fighting for the rights of DSD athletes who face what she calls discrimination under the current rules. Well, that's all we have time for. We will continue to bring more news updates from around the world.